one of the fundamental things that I feel why management miss this boat, or leaders miss this boat, is most of them, or especially people coming from like traditional waterfall ways of working, they they do not understand the fact that the software development work that we are doing falls under the complex domain category.
We agree and also partly disagree, right? There's absolutely nothing wrong with waterfall in context.
Absolutely true.
Correct.
Yeah, if you look at large public transport infrastructure projects, telecoms, they have 4 to 5 year projects which are waterfall based. And I still remember working with Telstra in Australia, and because nobody got promoted unless they were agile, but they knew they had to do waterfall, they created
Correct.
1 year sprints so they could pretend they were really being agile, and that's sort of nonsensical.
I think there's a certain leadership strategies or skills are more effective in a particular context. Is that makes more difference over here?
I mean, trait-based leadership qualities, I think, is a real problem because there aren't universal traits.
Mm-hmm.
Are you an agile practitioner who is puzzled where to begin in terms of choosing the right delivery approaches? Do you want to understand better ways of decision making or learn a sense making tool, Cynefin Framework, in detail? Then stay tuned to today's episode on the topic utilizing Cynefin Framework for choosing delivery approaches with our guest Dave Snowden, where he explains Cynefin Framework with different anecdotes and examples from his experience. Dave is a keynote speaker, author, creator of the Cynefin Framework, founder and chief scientific officer of the Cynefin company, and originated the design of SenseMaker, the world's first distributed ethnography tool. His work is international in nature and covers government and industry looking at complex issues relating to strategy and organizational decision making. He has pioneered a science-based approach to organizations, drawing on anthropology, neuroscience, and complex adaptive systems theory. So without much ado, let's welcome Dave Snowden.
Hello, Dave. Welcome to the podcast by Agile Coaching Roundtable. It's a great honor and pleasure having you on our show. Thank you so much for joining, despite your late night flights and busy schedule. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's a pleasure.
Okay, to begin with, today we want to have a conversation regarding the famous Cynefin framework, and also want to understand how can leaders benefit using Cynefin framework in decision making or leading their teams or organization in general. So to begin with, I would like to understand a basic thing, that what is a sense making model. Could you explain what is sense making model for our audience?
Okay, so we call it a framework, not a model, and that's an important distinction. So a model seeks to represent the world, yeah, and that's very difficult to do, whereas a framework says there are these perspectives through which you can look at something. So Cynefin, at its heart, I mean, it has 3 layers when we explain it, right? The simplest way of explaining it is what's called the 3+1 model. And that says there are 3 fundamental types of system in nature. Well, actually there's 5, but only 3 are relevant here, maybe 6, which are ordered, complex, and chaotic. So an ordered system is highly constrained, it's predictable. A complex system is highly connected, but that makes it less predictable. And a chaotic system has no connections. And one of the most common mistakes is people confuse chaos with complexity. The example a lot of people give of chaos is, trying to drive in Mumbai. Now, actually, that isn't chaos, that is complex. If you walk in a straight line across the road, nothing will hit you, provided you're consistent in pace, because the system is actually adjusting based on micro interactions. So that's a complex system. It may appear complex and chaotic to others. Yeah? And we often use the metaphor between them as solid, liquid, and gas. So order is solid, complex is liquid, gas is, chaos, and that indicates the level of containment problems you've got. And it also gives you the concept of a phase shift. So you heat water up to 100 degrees, it doesn't become steam until you put more heat in. And in Cynefin, all of those three boundaries are phase shift boundaries. So if you shift something from being ordered to complex, you lose control, but you gain energy. And therefore you gain novelty. And that's kind of like a management decision. If you want to move something from complex to ordered, that takes a huge amount of energy and it may not be worth the investment. Yeah, so give an example on that. Informal networks are complex, formal systems are ordered. Actually maintaining the two in parallel is the way you handle silos. You don't try and formalize cross-silo communication, but you build network density across them. And then the final part of basic Cynefin, and the bottom domain is if you over-constrain a system, you get catastrophic failure. Yeah, that's into chaos. The central domain everybody neglects, and that's the most important one. And if you think, going back to my metaphor, the triple point, there's a point where it's equiprobable whether something can become solid, liquid, or gas. And that's the central domain of Cynefin, which is called aporia, for the Greek word, which means questions that you can't answer unless you think differently about the problem. And the basic principle of Cynefin is move into aporia, force yourself to think differently, and then decide what's ordered, what's complex, what would benefit from being chaotic, and that's a special case, and then move on from there.
That's really amazing, Dave, to put into perspective how the framework is maybe made or molded into different segments, and how it differs from complex to chaotic in that structure. But then how this framework basically help leaders understand and categorize the challenges maybe that organizations face. And I understand that the framework is focused or maybe specifically developed for organizations, and what are the implications for for leaders specifically to have it as an approach?
Yeah, I think if you have a look on Google or Google Scholar, you will find lots of cases where people have used Cynefin in all sorts of industries. I mean, it's actually taught at military command level in all of the US armed forces, right? And you can see that if you look in the second book from the general who led the troops in Afghanistan. Cynefin was actually used in special operations there to actually understand the situation as an alternative to systems dynamics, which is overcomplicated in a complex space. Yeah, assuming all of these multiple these multiple cause and effect relationships. But I think if you take it simple, when we move from 3+1, we then move on to the 5 domain model of Cynefin, and then we break order into 2, clear and complicated. Right now, that is not a phase shift difference. That's a rather arbitrary decision which will vary in context. But it also makes this really important distinction between best practice and good practice. So if you're in the clear space where everything is rigidly controlled, so in the UK we drive on the left, in Germany they drive on the right, that's what you do because everybody can see it's sensible, everybody buys into it, there's no dispute, that's best practice. Where you move into high dependency on experts, which is the complicated space, there you actually need to allow variation. And a big problem in organizations is they don't allow variation in that space. They try and choose one approach. And we see this driven by what Gary Klein fondly calls Six Sigma, which I think is one of the best names I've ever heard for something, all right? And that distinction between good and bad is in its own right. But the minute you move into the complex space, there's no such thing, because the number of combinations is so huge that using the past to determine what you do in the future is a mistake. And so what you have to do is to intervene in the system, and you intervene in parallel, not in sequence, which is why, by the way, Scrum is a complex to complicated movement technique, not a complex technique.
Correct.
Because you do multiple small things in parallel and you see what happens and then you respond. And this is what we call the AIMS framework, which we just published. So with any complex system, we have lots of what are called actants. So an actant is anything which has agency in the system. It could be people, but it could be a process, it could be a building design. And so all actors are actants, but not all actants are actors. Yeah. you have highly rich interactions, and you can modify the actants and you can modify the interactions. And then you need two more things: monitors to see what happens, and coarse scaffolding like we drive on the left, which is something you can take for granted. All right, so the whole process of managing complexity is monitoring for emergence. And as good things happen, you shift energy towards them. As bad things happen, you shift energy away. There's quite an interesting metaphor here. If you look in a forest, forest is arbitorial, so the tree roots go down, they're traceable. That's kind of like, take that as a formal organization. But then there's a rhizomic structure which connects all the tree roots in a symbiotic relationship, and that's deeply entangled, and that's complex, and that might be the informal network. The fascinating thing is older trees can actually use the network to divert resources to younger trees during periods of starvation. It's not a conscious decision, it's built into the system. And you can see the same thing happening in organizations. Informal networks give you access to energy you wouldn't have through the formal system. All right, so it's that building both. And so if you're in a management role, you need the informal networks, you need to be able to handle experimental probes, you need to be able to have monitoring systems, and hold a workforce monitoring is one of the things we do. So you can get real-time feedback as things are happening, and then divert energy to what's working. I'll give you one more example. We're currently working with some of the development banks, where it's easy to allocate 50 million, but it's difficult to allocate 100 groups of 500K.
Correct.
But everybody knows 100 500Ks would make a much bigger difference. This is kind of like me picking up on Grameen Bank. That's where I got the inspiration for this one. So what we do is we take 5% of the 50 million, and we say if 5 roles which have evolved in the community agree, they can spend 500K. But one of the roles is completely anonymous, so nobody knows who it is, which actually gives you financial control. So that actually allows you to very quickly deploy small amounts of money and then let the 95% follow the things which work. So you're not dependent on people being able to apply for grants. Now, we think that has huge implications for companies as well. So very rapid deployment of small amounts of resource, which can be time as well as money, see what works, then let your real investment follow the things which work rather than follow the people who are good advocates of their pet scheme.
Wow, that's amazing way of putting across and differentiating between what happens in different domains, from clear to the complex. And the best part was the example that you gave that made so much sense about the driving, the difference between the driving in UK and US. So yes, I mean, one of the fundamental things that I feel why management miss this boat, or leaders miss this boat, is most of them, or especially people coming from like traditional waterfall ways of working, they do not understand the fact that the software development work that we are doing falls under the complex domain category and not under the complicated category. And when they miss to understand this, what they feel is okay, now since we are in this complicated domain or work, let's put some expert and then try to get the work done. But they don't understand there are so many unknowns in complex domain, that only way that we can see whether the uncover the unknown is through just testing the hypothesis. What do you have to say on that? Is
so
that correct?
Let me agree and also partly disagree, right? There's absolutely nothing wrong with waterfall in context.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Yeah, if you look at large public transport infrastructure projects, telecoms, they have 4 to 5 year projects which are waterfall based. And I still remember working with Telstra in Australia, and because nobody got promoted unless they were agile, but they knew they had to do waterfall, they created 1 year sprints so they could pretend they were really being agile, and that's sort of nonsensical. I was one of the 3 founders of the SDM, which is one of the 3 inputs into the Agile Manifesto. We extensively use time boxes, because in a multi-project environment, what matters is date of delivery, which Agile people keep forgetting. It's kind of like, well, we'll deliver it when we're ready and you just got to accept it. Well, that's going to get you fired if I'm the CEO, right? If I've got multiple projects, I need to know I've got a date. So one complicated technique, which is very useful, is you have minimal viable product, maximum viable product. and we use jazz sessions to create those. You have minimum available resource, maximum available resource. You define roles that you want, and then people self-assemble provided they have all the roles present into teams and commit to deliver. Now, that actually using a psychological thing, if you join a team which you self-assemble, you're committed to its results. If you're allocated a team, you blame the team members. Now, what that means is I know on this date, I will get at least this for at most that. And that's actually really important in terms of business planning. And that's a complicated technique which has complex elements. Scrum, because it does linear iterations, is in Cynefin terms a liminal technique between complex and complicated, right? We have methods like for example, what we call trios, all right? So we use a transgenerational care, young, naive, inexperienced, but shit hot on the technology, if you'll excuse the language, right? With older, experienced systems architect or end system tester who's been around the block and knows that things don't work the way people think it does, together with your user trained to talk to IT people. And what we do is we throw 15 of those trios at a problem for 2 weeks and synthesize the results to go into the Scrum backlog. So the thing I think Agile needs to realize is to stop saying everything is complex, because it isn't. A huge amount of what you do is ordered or should be ordered if you had some basic discipline about the way you went around it. And the issue is a mixed methods approach. And the problem is because Agile got driven by single framework approaches, so Scrum is a brilliant collection of methods, but it's not a universal framework, right? Absolutely. And that's the problem. So, and what we've now got is people are trying to replace Agile. You've got Agile 2, you've got Fast, they're all repeating exactly the same mistake. But actually, interestingly, the modern ones have even got less behind them, because they don't come from an experience base. They've been cobbled together to produce training and certification revenue, right? So Agile needs to grow up. And growing up means that different things work in different contexts. There are no silver bullets. There's no wonderful thing. If we all adopt it, everything will be fine. And we've got to stop talking about Agile mindsets and Agile transformations, because they're both fundamentally errors, right? Transformation in particular is the way of guaranteeing something fails if you announce a transformation project.
So there's one important point that you did mention is we need to move over from the thought that Agile maybe is a mindset, or calling that word as a mindset. Would you like to talk more on that when we say it's mindset? Yeah. What's the concern over here?
You can blame Peter Senge and systems thinking for this, all right? Because and that's not the whole of systems thinking. That's systems dynamics, which is, to my mind, the one bit of systems thinking which you should throw out the window. We can retrieve things from cybernetics and soft systems. And so he started to use the metaphor of the body, which is always dangerous because it privileges the brain and then the employees of the feet. Well, kind of like, they've got some intelligence, for God's sake. But it's also cognitive framing. It says it's all about the way you think. Now, about 90% of the decisions you make are made by your social environment and your body, not your brain. Your brain actually only really activates deep thought if it sees anomalies. On a day-to-day basis, it doesn't do anything. And mindset and computers have mental models, human beings don't. We actually, as we scaffold a lot of our consciousness into the stories of the groups we work in, and that's fractal from society down to work group. So we're actually extremely energy efficient in the way we are a networked intelligence, not a cognitive intelligence. So we're not like a computer, we can't be programmed, so there are no mental models. Mindset then gets used as an excuse. Well, we have this wonderful Agile transformation program, it didn't work. We bought the safe miracle, all right, and 3 years later we're having to pretend it did, but we all know it didn't work, but we spent so much money we can't confess to that, which is the norm at the moment. The reason it failed is because you bastards didn't have the right mindset. So it blames the individuals, all right? Now, the reality is, mindset is, the way you think about a problem is an emergent property of actions over time. And this is the constant confusion of systems thinking of emergent properties of having causality. So people see that people who are innovative, creative, so they think if they make people creative, they will produce innovation, and it's nonsense. Because creativity and innovation both come from starvation, pressure, and perspective shift. They're actually both emergent properties. So we now talk about what are called the 3 A's. and these are things you can actually manage. So one is agency. Yeah, so what agency do act, dance in the system have? That comes back to that acting concept. Yeah. The other is affordance. This comes from biology, and this is what the new STRIME mapping framework does, is it maps where you can actually do anything. It doesn't start with where you want to be, it says, what can we actually change? Which is a much better starting point. So that's the affordance. And assemblage, this is Deleuzian epistemology, but we can make it simple. It's the way in which the stories in the society to which you belong form attractor wells that you can't escape from. Yeah, and those are actually important, because in an organization which has been through 3 agile transformations, the automatic trigger when you say we're having a transformation is, oh my God, here we go again. What do I have to pretend to be this time? Yeah. So we talk about effectively agency, assemblage, and affordance, and say what you need to do is to manage those 3. You first of all need to map them. Right? Once you've mapped them, you do micro changes. You see what happens when you do micro changes, and you do them in parallel. And if they work, you do more of them. And then the whole mindset issue emerges from those micro interactions.
Wow, that's again a beautiful thought that you have shared over here. And when we're talking about transformation, obviously, the leaders or the leadership plays an important role over here. But when talking about the complex environment, or maybe when we're dealing with certain unknowns that definitely exist, and where you're talking about the approach or the model that we need to have, do you think there's a certain leadership strategies or skills are more effective in a particular context? Is that makes more difference over here?
I mean, trait-based leadership qualities, I think, is a real problem, because there aren't universal traits. Yeah, I mean, you can see this, for example, in Steve Dennin's book on leadership, in that he's taken people. I work with most of the people he talked with. The only thing they had in common is they were arrogant bastards who told people what to do, but that isn't in the book, right? It's distilled into these wonderful qualities. And the same is true with the Agile book, right? These are attempts to distill recipes from a complex situation, and there aren't recipes, right? Secondly, we're actually really bad as individual decision makers. We evolved, and Malcolm Gladwell's Blink is a truly appalling book. Do not tell anybody in cognitive neuroscience you've taken it seriously, or you will be excluded from social communication, because rather like the crux in reinventing the organization, he cherry picks examples to support the thesis, which is really bad research. Yeah, the reality is individually we're poor decision makers. We evolved to make decisions in extended families and clans. Yeah, the maximum number of decision makers in an extended family is about 5. So it's fascinating. If you put people together in groups of 5 from radically different backgrounds, they will compromise. The minute you go bigger than that, they fall back into their tribes. And if you look at really good leaders, they take people with them who complement their skills, and they're normally about 3, 4, 5. So leadership is actually, if you look at it in practice, a distributed function, right? And that's actually where we're starting to go with this, is to actually build those structures into the system. So for example, in an aircraft, the crew always has a pilot, but who the pilot is can change between shifts.
Absolutely.
And that's starting to work to role-based decision making, right? And that's actually more effective. And I think that's kind of where we're going. We also use the Cynefin Framework, which I originally developed for knowledge management, which talks about artifact skills, habits, experience, and natural talent. We now use that to map leaders and leadership teams, because then we say what we need is not another Fred or another Sue, but we need another combination of these Cynefin elements. And again, that changes the way you think about leadership and recruitment. It's a collective entity, and it's this complex principle. You decompose and recombine. You don't imitate or replicate, yeah? Or that's not the way you scale. You scale by decomposition and recombination.
Wow, that's so amazing, and it makes so much sense. And the best part is what you mentioned is the pilot. Depending upon the who pilot is, everything else changes, right? So that's exactly what we also say whether we practice Agile or Scrum or basically dealing with any teams as leaders. What we say is that obviously the way we approach things as an individual or based on the dynamics of the team, is what should our approach change. And if we are trying to imitate what approach we had taken for our earlier teams, and definitely we are going to fail, because same approach might not work, because this is now new set of people and new teams that they are coming from different backgrounds. So is that correct understanding that we
Now,
need
I think
to?
one of
Yeah.
the strengths of Scrum is it realized that roles were important. So it defined roles, right? I think one of the mistakes it made is to create what should have been a temporary role as a permanent one. Right? So for example, Scrum Master or Agile Coach, the whole point about a coach is you should be independent of them pretty fast. So I mean, one of the things which has just happened, I was in Copenhagen last night, you're seeing mass layoffs of Scrum Masters because nobody can see what they're actually doing. Yeah, I mean, okay, they're coaching the team, that has value, but you have to have productivity. So I think role-based works, but you have to think about the perception of the role. And you also have to recognize that industry goes through cycles. So in a recession, somebody who isn't productive, it doesn't matter how they can argue that they're making other people productive, they're on that list and they'll disappear. Right? That's just the way, I've lived in corporate strategy. You don't get time to be nice about this. You've got to save some costs. You do the easy approach. Yeah. You draw up spreadsheets, you draw a line, and that's it. Right? So recognizing that up front is key. I think the problem is that because Scrum tried to be universal rather than specific technique, it didn't think about different roles in different contexts. So the example I gave of building the backlog, it's easy to train a user to talk to IT people. It's difficult to train IT people to understand users. You put them users together with experienced and inexperienced IT people in parallel teams. You build a network across the user population, which will make you seem more valuable because you can use that network when things go wrong. But also you're bringing diversity into the system. So you're having temporary roles as well as permanent roles. Now, I think people need to get much more sophisticated in this, and actually looking at things like the army and the airline industry is a good way of seeing how this works, because the army they don't assume they're going to get brilliant people. This is the classic HR mistake. We will only recruit the best. That's rather like one of our former prime ministers who said he wanted all schools to be above average, which rather indicated his wasn't in terms of basic mathematical ability, right? So we went to Eton. So what you actually want is that ability, to actually make ordinary people extraordinary through process. That's what military environments do, and they do it through process. But the roles can change instantly. So a weapons sergeant in the Singapore army has authority over a general in respect to their weapon. People forget this. Military models are hugely adaptive, and they can delegate command without loss of authority, and they can adjust very quickly in different contexts. So I think, if you look at it, scientific management, which everybody decries, but nobody knows what the hell it is, they've just decided it's a bad thing, actually worked off a military model. And Taylor actually was humanizing the workforce, if you look what came before. When people criticize Taylorism, they're actually criticizing business process re-engineering in the first manifestations of systems thinking. Which tried to dehumanize the workplace and take an engineering model of management, not a military model of management. And when I taught leadership with Peter Drucker, which I did on 3 glorious occasions, right, one of the things we said is there's a huge amount in common between scientific management and complexity theory, because both of them recognize human judgment. Whereas systems thinking tried to remove human judgment and make everything into an engineering framework. And so some of my work, I was arguing this in the 80s, all right, is that people are objects too. And object orientation is not the same thing as microservices. So if you look at it, people have inheritance, they have polymorphism, you can define input-outputs. You can start to build systems in which crews, that's combinations of roles, actually have function within the system. So you can output from a technology into a human process and output back again. That actually gives you far more flexibility in design than trying to automate everything. And now we can add the third component, which is AI. But then you have to think really strongly about your training data sets, because actually AI is, the training data sets are never epistemically balanced. And you've got to think about that, and you've got to think about the application. And you've also got to think about the consequences, because if human beings don't go through the processes which AI can now do more effectively than them, how do they actually develop the higher cognitive capacity anyway? I had this big argument with Sam Polizano once. He wanted to get rid of middle management. And I said, where the hell do you think senior management come from? Yeah, if they don't go through that process, they don't develop the higher cognitive skills. Yeah, and that's what we need to start thinking about. We need to start thinking about a balanced ecosystem.
Wow, so many questions from the last conversation itself. So definitely one is you spoke about system thinkings, right? So can you maybe elaborate more on system thinkings and complexities?
Okay, so I mean, first of all, systems thinking and complexity have some overlaps, but they come from different origins. Yeah, complexity starts with three-body problem. It goes on with biology, it's chemistry, it's primarily natural science, right? I say there are some interactions, but most of us, for example, think that Gregory Bateson is much more in the complex world than the systems thinking world. But if you take systems thinking, there's three dominant groups. One is systems dynamics, right? And that's barely known through Sengi's simplification of Forrester's work, yeah? And that says we got these things, we can draw causal loops, we can build more and more complicated diagram, yeah? And you end up with the famous example in Afghanistan, where the general takes one look at it and says, well, if we ever understand that, yeah, we've won the war, right? Because it's an analyst framework, and it's the point is there isn't that sort of causality, yeah, within the system. I mean, that was Stan McChrystal, whose name I forgot earlier, so I'll have to apologize for him profoundly on that. So that was systems dynamics, and I think that's had its day, right? Because the modeling is much better. When Forrester did that, it was brilliant. It was the first time we actually modeled a whole system. But now we've got agent-based simulation, we've got AI, we understand actants, we've got the whole Santa Fe Institute. So complexity has moved simulation on into a whole different realm from that approach, right? But it's still taught. Soft systems with Peter Checkland, which is where I came from, that still has utility because it uses visualization and abstraction, which we now know is important. It was also Lancaster University, like I was, so there's a thing on that. The trouble is it doesn't scale. It's a workshop technique, but it doesn't scale. Right? But if we take those principles, there's things we can do it. And then cybernetics is the problem child. I personally don't think BA would ever have invented VSM if he'd known about complexity theory. And this is the thing everybody keeps getting wrong, like double loop learning, all right? I mean, kind of like, well, when it came out, it was a good idea. But now we know more, science progresses, and it doesn't mean that we don't respect what happened in the past, but we need to move on, yeah? So I don't see any value in VSM because it's a complicated approach in a complex domain. But the pattern language approach, as you see with Alexander, with Patrick's work, for example, on strategy, that's hugely valuable, but only if you break it down to a final level of granularity. At the moment, it's too coarsely grained, so it creates too much structure. Yeah. So I think what some of us are now trying to start to say is, look, complexity has this different strand. It knows that granularity is key. These things have value. So how do we get this synthesis and integration? But please stop calling complexity a subset of systems thinking, because it isn't. And the other is stop talking about seeing systems holistically, because if you say that, that just shows how ignorant you are. You can't see a system holistically. You can put monitors in place so what the system is capable of becomes visible to you. But if you think you can see a system holistically, then all you're doing is imposing your limited vision of what's possible onto something and destroying your capacity to see weak signals and opportunities.
Wow. The last sentence especially that you mentioned about that, we say that we know the system enough holistically, and then we try to put our limited knowledge to it and try to bring in some sort of kind of methods or approaches to make sure that we crack that system and this is how it is going to work, and only to figure out that that was another hypothesis that went wrong.
Yeah, and I think there's a key principle on this is what people don't do is they don't map the territory before they start the intervention. And we know from a whole body of research that human beings are incapable of doing an objective situational assessment if they've already got an idea of what they want to do. So if you start off with objectives, either overt or covert, all right? Fundamentally, people will assess the situation to support their favorite action. So, for example, what we do in S-drive mapping is we stop that. And we say, what are the constraints, what are the constructors? We map them onto a grid between energy cost of change and time to change. Nobody can game that by determining output because we've dropped the granularity right down. Then we identify the things which can't change because they take too much energy and time. The rest is the affordance space. And then we focus on people on micro interventions to change the energy gradient so the things they might want are easier, but they'll find out in discovery. Right? So that's a pre-process, which is actually taken off faster than Cynefin did. Right? Now, the principle of that is understand the situation as objectively as possible before you do an intervention. What actually happened with systems thinking is people start off with an off-site workshop led by expensive consultants. They create a vision of the future, they write it down, and like Moses coming down from Mount Sinai, they present it on tablets of stone and nobody's allowed to change it, right? That's actually the worst way of engaging employees and the worst way of reducing risk. Yeah, no military person would start without a map. What's the territory? Where are the enemy disposed? What can we do? Right? How do we discover it? We'll send out 5 patrols and see who doesn't come back. We know the enemy are there, right? And so on, all right? And I think that inability to separate situational assessment for action, that came out of this belief, and you see it in Sengi, right? The popular ends of system thinking said the way you cope with uncertainty is you define objectives and let people self-organize. The trouble is, in a complex system, you can't define objectives because there are too many possibilities. Objectives produce perverse outcomes. So OKRs are a complete disaster in Agile. Yeah, because they're okay in the complicated domain, but they're a disaster in the complex domain because what they do is we have to achieve the OKR, and it's Stratton's variation of Goodhart's law. The minute a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a measure. Yeah, because people focus on target achievement and then they're not open to discovery on the pathway. So one of the other things we say, a big difference between complexity and systems thinking, well, one is that in complexity, systems don't have to have boundaries. In systems thinking, systems always have boundaries, right? Because it's the only way their ideas would work, right? But the big one is in complexity, you start journeys with a sense of direction and journeys in parallel, yeah, not in sequence. Whereas in systems thinking, you start with a goal. Now, if you start journeys with a general sense of direction, you're open to novelty on the pathway. If you have goals, you ignore novelty because you're on the 1-year plan, the 2-year plan, the 3-year plan, the OKR target for this quarter, all of those things, right? And it's just bad science to give outcome-based targets in a complex world.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, since you spoke about the board like a situation where we initially send out, a small group to just identify where the locations, or maybe just to get the understanding of what the enemy is coming up with, maybe just to give that sense of where or what kind of weapons they do have in terms of. So that's again, more of a probe kind, and then sensing what the situation is. And
You got it.
Yeah, and in similar situation, when sense making is a critical aspect of any situation, maybe again in a complex environment, how can leaders enhance their sense making skills, and what tools or practices can assist in this process?
So there are 3 things. I mean, one of the other ways to look at a complex system is to compare a Gaussian distribution with a Pareto distribution. Yeah, so in a Gaussian distribution, a bell curve, you can eliminate the outliers. In a Pareto distribution, the outliers are fat tails, so you can't eliminate them. And a Gaussian distribution works because everything is random. The minute you connect things, the distribution has become Pareto. Right? So in the tails of a Pareto distribution, you don't get repetition between past and future states. So you can't use an inductive approach. You can't use cases. You can't use the past to determine the future. Right? And that's where you switch into what's called abductive approaches. Logic, deductive, inductive, abductive. Abductive is all about intuitive leaps. And that actually matches in with feeding strategies. Animals do a sort of random walk, then they do a sudden leap, then another random walk. Right? Because that optimizes feeding. Right? Human beings do the same sort of thing. So in the tails of a Pareto distribution, you need processes which will reveal what is possible you can't determine in advance. So 2 things on that. One is the one I just gave you. So we use teams of 3 or teams of 5. We distribute decision-making authority into those, which is not the same as delegating. We see what works, and that tells us where to put our resources. That saves us a huge amount of time and energy. The other is, and I've been C-level most of my life, right? You sit at your desk and 5 teams come in with stuff they've been working on for 6 months. They've got it researched. The PowerPoint is perfect. They all present these ideas, and you're meant to decide which is right in 5 minutes. And you've got no bloody idea what they're talking about, all right? They're all experts. Yeah, so you tend to go with, oh, that guys were right last time, or I can't stand that guy. Or to be honest, most of your decisions are political. If that goes through, I'm going to lose status. Yeah, politics really matters at C-level. Everybody forgets this. Strategy is all politics and it's dirty, all right? What you do instead is say, okay, you 4 are coherent, you're not coherent. Yeah, so that's a bad idea. All 4 of you, here's a small amount of money, go away and do an experiment, and you do them in parallel. See what works. That actually saves you a huge amount of trouble at the C-level. Yeah, you don't have to do commission second research if it's a coherent idea, and it's easy to agree that something is coherent. You don't have to agree it's right, but you can agree it's coherent. Yeah, go away and do something small, we'll see what happens, but you've got to do it in parallel. One of the reasons for that is a thing called the Hawthorne effect, if you know that. Okay, so this is 1920s scientific management. They were looking at worker productivity in the Hawthorne cable manufacturers in upstate New York. And so they increased lighting levels and people became more productive. Now, in the modern world of Agile, they would now publish a book called Light, the Secret to Productivity, and sell certification courses in how to switch on lights, right? Then they had some pretense to be real scientists, so they lowered the lighting level and people became more productive. And what they found is if you do something novel and pay attention, it always works the first time. So pilot projects are actually disastrous because they're always going to work, but they won't scale. That's why in Cynefin, we say you do smaller pilots in parallel and you make sure there's contradiction between the pilots, because then you explore the space. And by the way, that costs you a lot less money than more research and executive time deciding what's right.
Okay, that's again an amazing to put across the thoughts in terms of how to approach or how to have that sense and approach kind of a approach towards anything that we do in terms of project management activity to in specific to the software world, that we can say. And again, to a leading question to that is effective sense making, or maybe sense making is crucial in leadership, and what methods can help leaders enhance their sense making skills when dealing with complex problems specifically?
I've just given you some. So distribute dealing with the problem into small groups working in parallel, either a limited number of teams or actually a broad group. Right? That's the AIMS framework. Change the actors, change the interactions, monitor what happens. Yeah, think about your scaffolding. I mean, there are different types of scaffolding. So for example, there's a big difference between an endoskeleton and exoskeleton in nature. So you can never get the giant ants of horror movies, because an exoskeleton in Earth's gravity can't support something bigger than, I think, about 1.5 meters, right, before it breaks. Whereas an endoskeleton, which we have, can support huge sizes because it provides a basic coherent structure, but it doesn't contain. So a lot of companies, and this is some of the work we do, is how do you define the scaffolding? Right? Is it exto? Is it endo? Is it what's called a micro lattice? Yeah, which is where you put a healing lattice over a burn. It's a nutrient lattice, and it gives us the scaffolding around which the skin can grow, but then it dissolves into the skin. Yeah, or steel scaffolding. These are scaffoldings designed to move once the system has enough stability. So that's what you also make a decision as a leader, right? What scaffolding do we need at the point? Yeah, do we need it rigid? Do we need it flexible? Do we need it to go away? And that, again, that was a big mistake Agile made. They confused the scaffolding with the method. Yeah, scaffolding something with scrum masters up front is critical, but basically they need to dissolve into the system. I mean, not physically, you understand, but you know what I mean, right? So again, it's in leadership, you're working with other people, you're managing an ecosystem. You want to and energy minimization is key. Energy is money, resource, everything else. All of evolution tends to energy minimization. So if you know what has the lowest energy gradient, you know what's going to win.
Correct.
We're now starting to use the S-Trine framework to replace scenario planning, because energy gradients are a better predictive capacity than a group of people sitting together for 2 days brainstorming ideas. Right? It's more scientific. So the key thing is, think of yourself as managing a garden if you want. You need to keep the wildflower area because that's your source of genetic variety if something goes wrong. You need to see where people walk before you build the paths. To use the classic case, you need borders, you need to think about it, you need to understand the affordances. There's no point in trying to grow cactus in a paddy field, for God's sake. But some companies try and do that because they see some other companies had this huge success and they forget the context in which it worked. That was the problem with the Grameen Bank. It worked in a matriarchal community in Bangladesh. It did not work in a patriarchal community in Africa because the social affordances were radically different. So I'm not going to give you a magic bullet. I'm going to say, that this is what you're doing. You're managing something complex. And the other thing, I think, when you get into senior leadership roles, you suddenly realize you can't do anything anyway. You actually have less authority. The people with the real authority in companies are middle management. Leaders can appoint them and give them some direction and influence it, but you ain't got the bandwidth anymore to make the decisions, right? So actually, if you're trying to, one thing, I've come across the narco twice in my life, once in knowledge management and the other in Agile, right? And disagreed with him both times. But one thing he said, which was completely right, is change is middle, bottom up. You change middle management, who change junior management, and then leaders' response. You do not want to be a CEO-led project. That dooms you. Middle, bottom up is a good thing to remember.
Wow, that's so. I think this is something I have heard for the first time. The point that you mentioned about middle bottom up, that's amazing point of view to look at. I'm definitely going to reflect back on this, how and what can be done in my context or in my perspective. So you talked about AI some time back. So and I know that you also studied philosophy, and I also you mentioned that it's very easy for someone to teach Java, but what we need to teach people is to understand humans, right? So what is your take on this entire AI thing and the leadership role?
I'm giving a major lecture on this at the conference in Washington next week as it happens, so it's on my mind. I think there are a couple of general things. I think we've neglected the education of software engineers, right? Badly. So we don't train them in ethics. And they're making decisions on a day-to-day basis with implications they've got no capability of understanding. It is actually quite significant if you go through the history of software programming. Initially, it's all women. And then home computing comes out, and that's when the men take over. Right? So the danger is you've got people who spent their entire life on computers. I sometimes joke about this. You've got 40-year-old misogynist males who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty, which is grounds, as far as I'm concerned, to commit you to a mental hospital, right? And misogyny is a real problem in the Agile community. It's really significant, right? In scary ways. In fact, we're doing some work on weak signal reporting in that at the moment. So you need to start to think about technology in terms of its wider implications. So when I was at school, I know I'm getting old when I start to say this, we were trained how to use punch card machines. And I wrote my first computer program to fake my physics practicals. I couldn't see any point in doing practicals because I already knew the answers. So I wrote a program in BASIC, over a 300 mode acoustic coupler to the Kelson College computer, which actually faked physics practicals, and sold it to the first year 6 when we left, all right, because they wanted to do the same thing. Now, that was fun, right? But I still remember being told we would have a job for life if we learned how to use a punch card machine. Right?
Oh, wow.
Our headmaster also made us do RSA stage 3 typing, which actually for grammar school boys and girls at that time was, what the hell are we doing this for? That's done by dumb people in the other school. But that was the most useful skill he ever gave me because it was a motor skill, right? That's a much more finely grained skill, right? Now, anything you teach kids about programming now, first of all, they're probably doing it at home anyway. you actually is going to be out of date. And the focus on STEM education is designed to create people who will be got rid of 5 years after leaving university. You just take the latest tranche in, you exploit them like hell, you throw them out and get the new set through. In fact, if you haven't got into a management position in IT by the time you're in your 30s, you've got a problem, unless you're really gifted or on legacy system programs. Going on to legacy system programs is a good way of ensuring longevity because people know how important you are, right? So training in ethics, training in ethnography, training in anthropology are the key skills, that we've lost in the IT profession. And that's to the detriment of the IT, because actually IT people do not like people. They don't want users. They want the users to appoint one person to represent them and minimize the interaction with the users, when actually they need to be intermixed on a constant basis.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, that is the whole idea, right? All these days, I mean, the more we get up in the ladder is when we understand it's all about people, and if we deal with people in a very human way, we can get all these things done, and we can do wonders together.
Yeah. And remember my point. I mean, one of the things I was arguing last night, for example, at a big meetup, was Agile needs to start to use existing technology to satisfy unarticulated needs. At the moment, Agile is reacting to what people ask for, but the reality is users don't know what to ask for. What they're asking for is based on technology which was maybe 20 years ago. So we need to change that dynamic and change the interaction. And I think that's the shift from manufacturing. And currently, most Agile methods use a strong manufacturing metaphor. One of the reasons we went down the S-Strime model is to avoid flow concepts. Because we basically said in an estuary, the water flows in both directions, guys. It's not always in one direction, and it may be different things you can do at different turn of the tide, for example. So I think it's much more about starting to understand that. And I said two things last night. One is start to use your own employees as a sensor network, because IT has got access to them. Show executives how you can use your technology to help them make better decisions. Find unarticulated needs where existing technology can make a big difference to productivity. All of a sudden, you become a service department and a strategic function, not a manufacturing cost center. And if you're a manufacturing cost center, that is not a good place to be in a recession. I say this as a former person who used to sell outsourcing systems for IBM and data sciences. You loved a recession because you could take everybody over, make 30% of them redundant, and you made a lot of money in year two, right? And when the client learned what their staff used to do for them for free, but isn't in the service level agreement anymore.
Oh God, that's so true. And honestly, there are so many questions that are popping in my mind related to whatever conversation we had, but we will have or maybe pause that for the next conversation in the next podcast maybe. But for today, the last question I would like to check with you is that what advice do you have for aspiring leaders looking to apply the principles of Cynefin Framework in their leadership roles, especially in today's fast-changing and uncertain business landscape?
Okay, small things in parallel, fast, and use your employees' monitoring system. So the famous example I give on that is, if you give radiologists a batch of X-rays, you ask them to look for anomalies. On the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% of radiologists will not see it. Right? You need to find the 17% before they talk to anybody else. And you can only do that by using your employees as a sensor network in real time, so you can see dominant patterns, minority patterns, and outlier patterns. And you do lots of small things to stimulate the system. You stop big initiatives except in a major crisis. In a major crisis, you may have to act in a draconian fashion, but most of the time, you're actually manipulating your middle management, your junior management to do lots of small things. You're creating visibility, and you're letting the energy flow to things which will work rather than trying to decide in advance what the right thing is to do.
Wow, that's a great piece of advice, I would say. And thank you so much, Dave, for joining us today. Honestly, we had like questions that we wanted to ask you, but we did not follow the single question that we had in our list, and we ended up talking so many things, and it was so interesting to understand different perspective. I have personally learned so much from this episode. I'm sure our audiences, listeners and viewers would be learning too from this episode. So thank you so much, Dave, for doing this and coming over. It's a great honor and pleasure having you on our show, and looking forward to have more such conversation on our podcast show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really enjoyable. Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you so much for watching this episode patiently till the end. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll meet you again in the next episode. Till then, if you like our podcast show, then do like, share, subscribe, and let us know your feedback in the comment section. You can also listen to the episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Audible. Thank you.